I've always prided myself on being the guy who can blend in, the dependable best friend who doesn't make waves. So when Adam asked me to be his best man, I didn't hesitate. I didn't even flinch. Of course, I'd do it. I'd do anything for Adam. We've been through too much together for me to back out now. From the late-night talks in college to the awkward post-breakup therapy sessions, he's been there for me in ways most people aren't. But as I stood at the altar, watching Adam grin like he'd found the world's greatest treasure, something felt off. Maybe it was the way his fiancée, Lucy, smiled at him like she had the key to his soul, or how the guests gazed at them with that look of awe that always makes me a little uncomfortable. Or maybe it was just the fact that, despite all this, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still the third wheel. Sure, I had my place in Adam's life, but it was becoming harder to ignore that he didn't need me the way he used to. And I couldn't tell if I was being selfish or just painfully aware of my own quiet role in the story unfolding around me. I kept my smile wide, my hands steady, and my thoughts to myself as Adam and Lucy exchanged vows. The wedding felt surreal as weddings tend to, but there was one constant. Oliver, Adam's older brother. It's not that I hadn't seen Oliver before. He's a regular at family gatherings and holidays, but there was something different about him today. Maybe it was because I was hyper-aware of everything around me, but I couldn't stop noticing him. He was standing at the back of the chapel, arms crossed, watching his brother like he was cataloging every single moment. Oliver was always a bit of a mystery to me. He wasn't like Adam. He was quieter, more reserved, less likely to let his emotions spill out for everyone to see. He caught my eye briefly, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in his expression. I thought it was nothing at first, just a shared glance between two people who have known each other forever. But then something shifted. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I couldn't shake the feeling. The ceremony wrapped up, and I was immediately swept into the whirlwind of wedding photos, congratulatory hugs, and the endless parade of people who wanted to tell me how lucky Adam was to have such a great best man. Everyone was happy, smiling, in their little perfect bubbles. And then there was me, stuck somewhere between the joy of the occasion and the quiet weight of my own confusion. As the sun set and the reception got underway, I tried to push the thoughts of Oliver out of my head. It wasn't the first time I'd been around him. He'd always been a steady, almost fatherly figure in our group of friends, calm, grounded, always in control. I never thought twice about him, but now something was off. It wasn't just the way he was standing there by the bar, sipping his drink and watching the crowd like he was observing a world he didn't quite fit into. It was the way he seemed to be aware of me, too. I had seen that look before, on Adam, on people who knew me a little too well, and on people who were trying to decide whether to speak or not. The thing is, I was never the one to be observed. I was always the observer. I didn't like the feeling of being watched, especially by someone like Oliver. He had this way of looking at you like he was seeing right through you, past all the bullshit, straight to the core of who you really were. It was unnerving. I took a deep breath and approached the bar, pretending like I was just going to get another drink. But there he was, standing a little too close, his broad frame leaning against the counter as he glanced over at me. I felt my stomach tighten, my pulse quickened, and for some reason I couldn't look away. "Enjoying the wedding?" he asked, his voice low, just loud enough to reach my ears over the hum of conversation. "Yeah, it's perfect," I said, forcing a grin, trying to sound casual. I wasn't sure why, but my voice felt a little too tight. He nodded, and there was that same look in his eyes, like he knew something I didn't. "I think I saw you with Adam earlier," he said. "You two looked close." I chuckled awkwardly, feeling the weight of his words settle in. "Yeah, well, we've been through a lot together. He's like family." Oliver's eyes flicked to the dance floor where Adam was laughing, clearly lost in his own world. When he turned back to me, his gaze was more intense, and I felt my throat tighten. "Family," he repeated, his lips curling just slightly at the edges. "That's good." I didn't know how to respond. Something in the way he said it, something about the way he was looking at me, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I forced myself to look away, focusing on my drink as the sound of clinking glasses filled the space between us. I could feel Oliver's eyes still on me, though. I tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the wedding, on my duties as best man. But every time I glanced in his direction, I saw that same look. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something more, something unspoken. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was overthinking things, but the feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. It was like a current, running just under the surface. I didn't know how long I stood there, exchanging pleasantries with various people while Oliver lingered in the background, always just a few feet away. His presence was almost oppressive, but in a way that I couldn't explain. Every time I tried to breathe easy, to relax, I caught sight of him, his eyes following me, his posture still just a little too aware of where I was standing. Finally, the reception started winding down. The dancing had begun, and Adam was off in the middle of the floor with Lucy, surrounded by their friends and family, lost in the joy of the moment. I wasn't sure why I hadn't danced yet. It wasn't like me to stand off to the side. But tonight everything felt off. I found myself stepping out onto the porch, needing some space to clear my head. The cool air was a welcome relief after the heat of the crowded ballroom. I leaned against the railing, taking deep breaths, trying to push the confusion out of my mind. A few minutes later, I heard the door creak open behind me. I didn't turn around. I wasn't in the mood to make small talk. But when I heard Oliver's voice, low and steady, I couldn't ignore him. "Didn't expect to find you out here," he said, his voice warmer than before. He took a step closer, and I could hear the soft scrape of his shoes against the wooden floor. I didn't respond at first. The tension in the air felt too thick, too strange for me to know how to answer. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, leaning against the wall just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Just needed some air," I said finally. I hated how weak the words sounded. Oliver nodded, but he didn't leave. Instead, he stood there for a moment, like he was waiting for something. I shifted uncomfortably, feeling my heart rate pick up. "You're a good guy, Daniel," he said after a long pause. The words hit me like a ton of bricks, unexpected and heavy. I turned my head toward him, my mouth slightly dry. "What do you mean?" He looked at me for a long time, his gaze dark but not unkind. "I mean, you've always been there for Adam. Always. That's something that matters, you know?" I wasn't sure what he was trying to say, but his voice, the way he was looking at me, made it feel like we were standing on the edge of something dangerous. I felt myself stiffen. There it was again, the feeling of being observed, of being seen in a way that made me uncomfortable. And yet, I couldn't seem to look away from him. Before I could find the right words, Oliver pushed off the wall, taking a step toward me, his breath faintly visible in the cool night air. I swallowed, my pulse picking up. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, as though we were sharing some private moment. The shift in his tone was enough to send a wave of confusion crashing over me. What was he doing? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stand tall, though my heart was pounding. "Yeah," I said. "Everything's fine." But I wasn't sure I believed myself. And then, just like that, the storm that had been quietly brewing between us broke. I felt it in the air. I felt it in the space between us. And for the first time, I wasn't sure how to escape it. The morning after the storm, everything felt different. The air was still damp from the rain, and the clouds hung low in the sky, casting the world in a muted shade of gray. I hadn't slept much, lying awake for hours after Oliver and I spoke on the porch. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, his words echoing in my ears. "You're a good guy, Daniel," seemed so innocent, so simple when he said it. But the way he said it, the way he looked at me, made it feel like something more. Like he was trying to tell me something without saying it outright. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking it, that I was just still shaken from the night before. But the tension that had been building between us wasn't something I could ignore. I'd never been good at ignoring things. I got dressed in a haze, pulling on my suit again, making sure it was properly pressed for the wedding. It was hard to focus, though. My mind kept drifting back to Oliver, and I couldn't seem to shake the feeling that something was different now. Something had changed between us. I didn't know what it was, but but I felt it, and I couldn't just let it slide away. Not after last night. The wedding was today. I made my way to the venue, trying to keep my thoughts focused on the task at hand. I had a job to do. I was the best man after all. I couldn't afford to get caught up in this, whatever this was with Oliver. But the closer I got to the church, the more I realized that I wasn't just worried about the wedding or even Adam. I was worried about how I was going to see Oliver today, how I was going to face him without feeling the weight of what had happened hanging between us. When I arrived at the church, I found Adam surrounded by his family, all smiles and laughter. He was a bundle of energy, bouncing between people like he didn't have a care in the world. And maybe he didn't. He had everything he wanted, everything he'd worked for. A beautiful bride, a beautiful life ahead of him. The world was his and he deserved it. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy as I watched him. It wasn't that I wasn't happy for him, it was just everything seemed so perfect. And I was stuck in a weird, messy space between what I wanted and what I thought I should want. Between being the best man for my friend and the confusing feelings I couldn't seem to shake off when it came to his brother. I spotted Oliver near the back of the church, standing in quiet contrast to Adam's chaotic energy. He was leaning against a pillar, watching the scene unfold with an almost detached expression. He looked just like he had last night, like he was a part of everything and nothing at the same time. He was still wearing the same dark suit, the collar unbuttoned slightly, his sleeves rolled up as if he were trying to distance himself from the formality of the occasion. His hair was a little tousled from the storm, and something about his posture, arms crossed, gaze focused, made him seem untouchable, distant. I tried not to look at him, but I couldn't help it. Every time I glanced in his direction, my heart would pick up pace, and I'd feel that old, familiar discomfort stir in my chest. Something was happening between us, and I couldn't deny it any longer. I wasn't sure what it meant, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted to know. But the more I tried to avoid it, the more it seemed to pull me back in. The ceremony went by in a blur. I didn't have time to dwell on anything, really. I had my responsibilities as best man. Getting Adam's ring, making sure the groomsmen were in order, smiling for the photos. I went through the motions, my thoughts constantly drifting back to Oliver. And then, during the reception, it happened again. That pull. The ballroom was crowded, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and music. Adam and Lucy were dancing, completely wrapped up in their own world, and I found myself standing on the sidelines, drink in hand, watching them. I was happy for them, of course, but there was a hollow feeling inside me, one I couldn't shake. I caught sight of Oliver across the room, standing near the bar again. He was leaning against it, talking to some of the other guests, but his eyes kept flicking in my direction. I wasn't sure if he was looking at me because he was just scanning the crowd or if he was waiting for something. Couldn't tell, but I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, heavy and constant. When I felt his eyes on me again, I looked away quickly, my stomach twisting. I wasn't ready for whatever was happening between us. Not here, not now, but somehow the universe had other plans. I didn't expect it when he appeared beside me. His presence felt before I saw him. But there he was, standing just a little too close, his broad shoulders blocking my view of the rest of the room. He wasn't speaking, just standing there. And for a moment, I thought maybe he would leave me alone. But then he spoke, his voice quiet, low, like he was afraid someone might hear us. "You've been kind of distant today." His words were soft but edged with an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile, but it felt like it was made of thin glass. "Yeah, just, wedding stuff. Lots to do." He didn't seem convinced. He shifted slightly, turning his body toward me. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something I couldn't name, but it made my heart beat faster. "Is that really it?" Oliver asked, his voice quieter now, almost coaxing. "You've been on edge since last night." The words hit me like a jolt of electricity, and I felt my throat tighten. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. How was I supposed to explain it? How was I supposed to tell him that last night's kiss had been eating away at me? That every time I looked at him, I couldn't stop thinking about it. But I couldn't say that. Not now. Not with Adam just a few feet away. His joy so complete and bright. I couldn't bring this mess into the light. I'm fine, I said, forcing the words out even though I knew they were lies. Really, just a little tired, I guess. Oliver studied me for a moment, his gaze intense, like he was trying to read me. I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wanted him to just leave, to stop looking at me like that. But the other part of me, what I was trying so hard to suppress, wanted him to stay. Wanted to see if maybe this feeling, this pull, could be something real. I get it, he said finally. But there was something in his tone that made me think he didn't quite believe me. He paused for a moment, his eyes never leaving mine. And then, in a tone that was almost a whisper, he added, "But if you need to talk, I'm here." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as easily as he had appeared. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what to make of what had just happened. My breath came in shallow bursts, my thoughts scrambled. I needed to get away from him. I needed to clear my head, to focus on something, anything but this. I excused myself from the crowd, my legs carrying me toward the side door and out into the cool evening air. The quiet of the garden outside was a relief, but it also made everything feel more intense. Every little sound seemed louder, sharper, and my thoughts, they were all over the place, tumbling and spinning. I hadn't kissed Oliver. I hadn't really let myself think about it like that. But last night, that kiss had changed something. And now, no matter how much I tried to fight it, I couldn't pretend I wasn't drawn to him. I leaned against the stone wall, trying to catch my breath. What was happening to me? The night dragged on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Adam was off somewhere with Lucy, caught up in their newlywed glow, and the rest of the party carried on like everything was fine. But I wasn't fine. My thoughts were too loud, my mind too crowded with everything that had happened since last night. Oliver's words echoed in my head. Asterisk, if you need to talk, I'm here. Asterisk, it was simple, casual, but I knew it meant more than that. I could feel it. I could feel the weight of his gaze whenever it landed on me, like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to break. But I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. Every time I tried to calm myself down, to convince myself that nothing had changed, I'd feel the pull again, the draw of something unspoken, something that simmered just beneath the surface. I stepped back inside, hoping the noise and the warmth of the reception would distract me. But it didn't. I needed a distraction, something to pull me out of this spiraling mess of confusion and guilt. I grabbed another drink, trying to focus on the crowd around me. Maybe if I kept busy, kept my hands full, I wouldn't have to think about Oliver anymore. But the moment I turned around, I saw him again. He was standing near the door, scanning the room with that detached look he always wore. But his eyes flicked to me the second they landed on the crowd. I could feel the connection between us like a thread being pulled taut. I hated it. I hated how my heart picked up speed every time he looked at me. Every time he wasn't looking at me, as if I could feel him waiting for me. I couldn't stop myself. I found myself walking toward him, my feet carrying me without my permission. I didn't want to do this, didn't want to face him, but the longer I stood there, the more I realized that I had no idea what I was doing anymore. I was losing myself in something that shouldn't even be a part of my world. He noticed me approaching, his posture subtly shifting, as if he knew exactly what was happening, exactly what I was trying to do. And when he spoke, his voice was that low, almost intimate tone that made it feel like we were the only two people in the room. "Are you running away again?" he asked, the corners of his mouth pulling up just enough to make it look like a challenge, like he knew exactly what was going on inside my head. I stopped in front of him, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his body. And for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to lie, to deflect, but I wasn't sure I could anymore. I'd already crossed a line the moment I let myself feel this way about him. "I'm not running away," I said, my voice strained, as if I were trying to convince both of us. "I just needed a break. It's a lot, you know?" He nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what I meant. His eyes didn't leave mine, and for a second, it felt like the rest of the room disappeared. like we were the only two people who mattered. "I know," he said softly. "It's been a long day. You've got a lot on your plate." I didn't know what to make of his words. Was he just being polite? Or was he saying something more? I could feel the tension building between us, thick and heavy. He was standing so close now, and I couldn't tell if he was waiting for me to make the first move or if he was just standing there, waiting for me to acknowledge what was happening between us. I shifted uncomfortably, my fingers tightening around the glass in my hand. "I didn't expect this to be so weird," I muttered. It felt like a stupid thing to say, like I was fumbling for a reason, an excuse to cover up the unease that had settled in my chest. Oliver's gaze softened, and I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Something that looked almost like understanding, but also something else. Something more dangerous. "You don't have to pretend, Daniel," he said, his voice barely a whisper, and I swear I could hear the vulnerability in it. But there was something else, something beneath it that made my skin prickle. He wasn't just talking about the wedding. He wasn't just talking about the tension in the air. He was talking about something bigger, something unspoken between us. I froze. I wanted to pull away, wanted to leave, but the words were stuck in my throat. I didn't know what he meant by that. Pretend? Pretend that I didn't feel the draw to him? Pretend that I hadn't thought about him every minute since the kiss? My stomach twisted in knots. I wanted to back out of this conversation. I wanted to tell him it was nothing, that I was just overthinking everything. But the truth was, I couldn't. I couldn't lie to him any more than I could lie to myself. I was caught in something I didn't know how to escape from. Oliver took a step closer, closing the space between us. The air between us felt thick, suffocating. I tried to look away, to find something, anything, to distract me, but all I could see was him. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice even softer now, almost coaxing. "And I know you're scared." I took a shaky breath, my heart hammering in my chest. "I'm not scared," I lied. "I'm just confused." Confused about what? His question was so simple, so calm, and yet it felt like it had the power to break everything wide open. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain it? How could I tell him that the more I thought about him, the more I realized how much I wanted him, even if I couldn't fully understand it? Oliver's eyes searched mine, like he was waiting for me to break, to finally say the words that had been hanging between us for hours now. And I almost did. But then, just as I opened my mouth to speak, the door to the garden swung open behind us, and Adam appeared in the doorway, a big smile on his face. "There you guys are," he said, his voice light, oblivious to the tension that had been thickening between me and his brother. "Come on, it's time for the toast. Everyone's waiting." I felt the weight of the moment lift, if only for a second. Adam's interruption was a welcome relief, even if it felt like a lifeline I wasn't sure I wanted to take. I pulled away from Oliver, my heart still pounding in my chest, and tried to smile at Adam. "Right?" I said, forcing the words out. "Of course." Adam led the way back inside, and I followed, my steps slow and hesitant, still feeling the weight of what had just happened. The conversation with Oliver wasn't over. Couldn't be, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend it was. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Toasts were made, glasses clinked, and Adam and Lucy shared their first dance as a married couple. I was supposed to be there, enjoying the celebration, supporting my best friend on his big day. But all I could think about was the conversation I'd almost had with Oliver, the pull that still gripped me every time I saw him, every time he looked at me like I was the only person in the room. I found myself retreating to a corner as the night wore on, trying to find some space, some distance between myself and everything that had been building. But the more I tried to separate myself from it, the more it felt like the tension was following me, like I couldn't escape whatever it was that had started between Oliver and me. I needed to figure this out. I needed to understand what was happening before it completely unraveled me. As the night drew to a close, I couldn't help but feel like I was standing at the edge of something I wasn't ready for. I just wasn't sure what would happen if I took the step forward. The reception came to an end far too soon. I didn't want to be there anymore. but I didn't know where else to go. Adam and Lucy were off to their honeymoon. The rest of the guests slowly filtering out of the venue in groups, chatting excitedly about the day. But none of that mattered to me. I wasn't even sure how I'd ended up standing outside the church, by myself, staring into the night, trying to figure out what I was supposed to be feeling, what I was supposed to be doing. The cool evening air cut through me, but it didn't help clear my head. I was still tangled up in the events of the night, still wrestling with everything that had happened between Oliver and me. I had been so careful to keep my distance, to stay professional and composed. But Oliver had a way of making that impossible. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he'd looked at me, the way his words had felt like a direct invitation, a challenge. Maybe. He had been so close, so sure, and I had been paralyzed. I knew it was stupid, that I should have just said something, done something, but I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready to admit to myself what I was feeling. What was I feeling? Anyway, I leaned against the cold stone wall of the church, my eyes closed as I tried to breathe through it. The sound of distant voices carried on the breeze. I wanted to shut everything out. I wanted to be alone. But of course, that was the exact moment when I heard his voice again. So low, so close, it sent a shock through me. "You look like you're lost." I didn't need to open my eyes to know who it was. The familiar weight of his presence was enough to make me tense. I could feel Oliver standing behind me, just on the edge of my awareness, close enough that if I moved, I'd be brushing up against him. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how to. How could I? My thoughts were still too scattered, still wrapped around what had happened between us earlier. The way his eyes had searched mine, the way my heart had started to race when he spoke. I had been trying to pretend I wasn't affected by him, but that was becoming harder and harder with every passing moment. "Daniel," his voice again, softer this time, like he was waiting for me to react, to look at him, to say something. I finally opened my eyes, but I couldn't turn to face him right away. Instead, I just stared out into the empty parking lot, trying to keep myself grounded in something. Anything. That wasn't this mess. But I knew deep down that I couldn't keep pretending this was just nothing. I couldn't keep pretending that this was just some weird, fleeting moment. When I finally did turn to look at him, I couldn't stop the way my breath hitched. He was standing too close. His expression was unreadable, but there was an intensity to his gaze, something almost predatory that made the back of my neck prickle. He was so calm, so still, and it made me feel like everything was spiraling out of control. "I'm not lost," I said, my voice rough, even though I knew it was a lie. I wasn't just lost. I was tangled up in something that didn't have any easy answers. Oliver raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about that?" I wanted to tell him to leave. I wanted to say something that would push him away, make him back off, but I couldn't do it. Not when I was so aware of the way he was watching me, so aware of the way his eyes seemed to follow every movement I made. It was suffocating, and yet, it was the only thing that felt real in the moment. "I don't know what I'm doing," I muttered, finally admitting the truth, even if it was just to myself. "I don't know what any of this is." Oliver stepped a little closer, just enough that the space between us seemed to shrink. I could feel the tension in the air around us, thick and undeniable. His gaze dropped briefly to my lips, and then he looked up at me again, his expression unreadable. "I think you do," he said quietly. "I think you've known for a while." I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to say I was just confused, that I was just going through a phase, or that this wasn't a big deal, but deep down, I knew that was a lie. The way my heart beat faster when he was near, the way I couldn't seem to shake the feeling of his touch lingering on my skin. All of it was real, but I couldn't accept it. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face the truth of what I was feeling. Oliver stepped closer again, closing the gap between us until I could feel the heat of his body just inches from mine. My breath caught in my throat as he reached out, his hand lightly grazing my arm. The touch was almost casual, but it sent a shock through me that made my whole body stiffen. "You're not the only one who's confused," he said, his voice soft, but there was a depth to it that made everything inside me twist. But I don't think it's just confusion anymore. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out. I couldn't form words. All I could focus on was the way he was looking at me, the way his thumb was brushing over my skin, as if he was waiting for me to make the next move. I was so close to losing control, to crossing a line I wasn't sure I could come back from. "I can't do this," I whispered. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to pull away. But I had to. I had to protect myself from whatever this was, even if it meant turning my back on it, pretending it wasn't happening. But Oliver didn't let me. Before I could take a step back, he moved forward, his hand pressing against my chest, stopping me. And then, without another word, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, just for a moment, soft and tentative. But that was all it took. That one small touch. Everything inside me snapped. I didn't know what came over me. All I knew was that I couldn't resist anymore. I kissed him back, harder this time, my hands reaching for him, pulling him closer. The world around us seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of us, tangled together in something I couldn't name, something I couldn't fight. But even as I gave in, even as I let myself be consumed by him, the guilt twisted in my gut. Adam's face flashed in my mind, his smile, his trust. I was betraying him. I was betraying everything I'd ever thought I knew about myself. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop kissing Oliver. Couldn't stop wanting him. When we finally pulled apart, I gasped for air, my chest heaving. Oliver's hand was still resting on my chest, his touch grounding me, keeping me in place. "You don't have to stop," he said softly, his voice a low murmur, almost a plea. "But you can't pretend it's not real." I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't know what to do with the feelings that were crashing over me, overwhelming me. I wanted to pull away, wanted to run, but I couldn't. Not now. Not when everything felt so impossible to ignore. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with everything we both knew but weren't saying. I wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. But I couldn't deny it anymore. "I don't know how to fix this," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do." Oliver just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped back, just enough to put some space between us. "You don't have to fix anything," he said quietly. "You just have to stop pretending it's not happening." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavier than anything I'd felt all night. And as I stood there, my heart still racing, I realized that this was just the beginning. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but I couldn't run anymore. Not from him, not from myself. I didn't know what to say to Oliver after that kiss. My mind was a blur, and my heart was racing too fast for me to catch up with. But I couldn't pretend it didn't happen. I couldn't go back to acting like everything was fine, like nothing had shifted between us. Everything had shifted, and I wasn't sure how to navigate it, how to make sense of it. We stood there for a long time, the air thick with unspoken words, the reality of the situation sinking in deeper than I wanted to admit. My body felt alive, electric, but my mind was a mess, a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. I didn't know what was happening between us, but it felt too real to ignore. Oliver was the first to break the silence, his voice quiet but steady. "You don't have to say anything, Daniel. I know this is a lot, but we don't have to rush into anything." I wanted to say something, anything, but the words were trapped in my throat. How could I explain how it felt to be pulled between guilt and desire, between what I knew I shouldn't do and what I couldn't stop myself from wanting? "I don't know what this is," I said finally, my voice rough. "I don't know what you want from me." Oliver's expression softened, and I could see the understanding in his eyes. He stepped closer, his presence both comforting and unsettling at the same time. "I don't want anything from you, Daniel. I just don't want you to keep pretending like we don't feel this." I shook my head, unable to meet his eyes. "I can't just ignore it, but I can't." My throat tightened, the weight of everything I was trying to hold in threatening to break through. "I can't do this to Adam." The words stung as they left my mouth, but they were true. Adam was my best friend. He trusted me. He'd brought me into his family, into his life. I couldn't betray him like this, not when he had been nothing but kind to me, nothing but open and supportive. But every time I tried to picture my life without Oliver's presence in it, it felt like something was missing. Oliver didn't say anything right away, just watching me with that steady gaze, as if he was waiting for me to come to terms with everything myself. I wanted to believe him when he said he wasn't asking for anything, but the way he looked at me, the way his hand had touched me, it felt like more than just words. "I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I just want you to stop pretending like you don't want this. We can figure it out together." My heart stuttered at his words, and for a moment, I thought I might break. I wanted so badly to believe him, to give in to whatever this was between us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was wrong, that it was a betrayal of everything I had worked so hard to build with Adam. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, more to myself than to him. Oliver's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, I saw the vulnerability in them that matched what I was feeling. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and I didn't pull away. Couldn't. "You don't have to figure it out tonight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just don't shut me out." I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to reconcile what I was feeling with what I knew was right. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something huge, something life-changing, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to face it. But I couldn't deny the pull. Not anymore. "I can't keep doing this," I said, the words coming out in a rush, as if I had to say them or else I might lose the courage to speak at all. "I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way about you." Oliver stepped closer, his presence overwhelming but comforting all at once. "Then stop pretending," he murmured, his voice like a promise, like something we were both too afraid to admit. I didn't know how to react, didn't know how to move forward. But the truth was, I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I couldn't keep lying to myself, lying to Oliver, lying to Adam. "I don't know what this means," I said, my voice shaky. "I don't know how to fix this." Oliver placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch warm and grounding. "You don't have to fix anything. You just have to let yourself feel it, Daniel. Stop running from it." I wanted to argue, to say that I couldn't just let go, that there was too much at stake, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision before me pressing down on me. "Do you want this?" Oliver asked, his voice low but insistent. "Do you want me?" I didn't answer right away. My mind was a storm, and I couldn't make sense of it. But there was a part of me, a part one couldn't ignore anymore, that wanted him. And the more I fought it, the more I realized that I couldn't escape it. When I finally opened my eyes, Oliver was watching me intently, waiting for me to say something. "I don't know what this means for us," I said quietly, "but I know I can't walk away from this." His gaze softened, and I saw a flicker of relief in his eyes. He stepped forward, his lips brushing against mine in a gentle kiss, like a promise, like a question, and I let myself give in to it. I let myself feel the connection, the pull that had been building between us for so long. But even as I kissed him back, even as I let myself sink into it, a part of me was screaming inside. Adam's face, his smile, his trust. It all felt like it was slipping through my fingers, but I couldn't stop now, couldn't turn back. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathing heavily, our foreheads pressed together. "We can't tell him," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We can't let him find out." Oliver didn't respond at first, but I could feel him tense, could feel the conflict running through him. Finally, he nodded, but his expression was guarded, like he was holding something back. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice firm, but there was a hint of uncertainty in it. "We'll figure out what comes next." I wasn't sure what came next. I wasn't sure what I was doing, what we were doing, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything that had happened between us. I wasn't sure where this would lead, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back, and neither could Oliver. I thought the hardest part would be the kiss, but I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing that I couldn't take it back. There were no resets, no easy outs. Everything that had happened between Oliver and me had changed the fabric of everything I thought I knew about myself, and more importantly, about my relationship with Adam. It had been a week since the wedding, a week since I had kissed Oliver, since everything had started to unravel, and I still couldn't figure out where I stood. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened between us, how it had felt so inevitable, like some truth I'd been denying for so long had finally been forced into the light. But it wasn't just the kiss. It was the way we spoke without words, how he could touch me and somehow make it feel like the most natural thing in the world. It was the power he had over me, the pull I couldn't seem to fight, no matter how many times I told myself that it was wrong. The guilt never really left. Every moment I spent with him was a reminder of the betrayal. I hadn't told Adam anything, not yet, and I couldn't bring myself to break his heart, couldn't find a way to explain to him that everything I thought was real, everything I had been protecting, was slipping away. I didn't know if I could live with myself if I hurt him, but I also didn't know how much longer I could live with this secret with Oliver between us. I was sitting in my car, parked a few blocks away from the cafe where I had planned to meet Oliver. I had been sitting there for a few minutes, staring at the steering wheel, trying to find the courage to get out of the car. The air was thick with tension. I hadn't spoken to Oliver all day, and even though I had spent most of my week replaying everything that had happened between us, there was a part of me that wasn't sure what to expect from him anymore. He had made it clear that he didn't want to rush things, that we could take our time. But I wasn't sure how much more time I had left before I cracked. I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend everything was fine. Finally, I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, my legs a little shaky as I made my way into the cafe. Oliver was already there, sitting in a corner booth, looking as calm as ever, like none of this was weighing on him. When he saw me, his lips curled into a slight smile, but there was something guarded in his eyes. He was waiting for me to make the next move. I slid into the booth across from him, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I didn't know where to begin. I didn't know if there even was a beginning anymore. "Are you okay?" Oliver asked after a long pause, his voice steady but soft, like he was trying to gauge my mood. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if that was true. "I'm fine," I said, but the words felt hollow. I wasn't fine, not by a long shot. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching mine. "You're not fine, and I'm not fine either, Daniel." His voice was quiet but firm. "We can't keep doing this, pretending like we don't know what's happening." "I know," I whispered, feeling the weight of the words. "But I can't hurt him, Oliver. I can't hurt Adam." Oliver's expression softened, but there was a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "I'm not asking you to hurt him, but you're hurting yourself by pretending. You're torturing yourself by holding on to something that's already falling apart." I felt a sharp pang in my chest at his words. He was right. In some ways, everything was already falling apart. I was holding on to this illusion of control, this idea that I could protect everyone, but I couldn't. I was drowning in guilt, and every day I spent with Oliver made it harder to breathe. But every time I tried to walk away, the pull was stronger. The truth was undeniable. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I don't know how to fix this." Oliver reached across the table, his hand brushing mine. A simple gesture that felt too intimate in the quiet of the cafe. But I didn't pull away. Couldn't. His touch grounded me in a way I wasn't prepared for. "You don't have to fix anything, Daniel," he said softly, his voice steady but full of conviction. "You just have to let yourself be honest. With me. With yourself." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I had been lying to myself for so long, hiding from what I felt, pretending that everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. But I couldn't keep running from it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that this wasn't happening. When I opened my eyes again, I looked at Oliver, really looked at him, the man who had become both my temptation and my fear. And for the first time, I didn't see him just as a danger to my relationship with Adam. I saw him as someone who was just as lost as I was, someone who had become a part of me in a way I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. "I don't want to hurt anyone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know if I can stop." Oliver's gaze softened, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes that made me feel less alone in this mess. "I'm not asking you to stop," he said. "I'm asking you to stop pretending you're not already in this." His words settled in my chest, and I felt the truth of them, even if I wasn't ready to accept it. I wasn't ready to let go of the safety net I'd built around myself, the one that kept me from confronting the chaos I had invited into my life. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about me or Adam. This was about something bigger, something deeper that I couldn't ignore anymore. "I don't know what happens next," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "But I can't keep pretending that this is just a mistake." Oliver nodded, his expression serious but not unkind. "Then don't. We'll figure it out, Daniel. We'll figure out what comes next together." But even as he said that, I knew we couldn't keep pretending forever. There would be consequences. There always were. Adam would find out eventually, and when he did, everything would change. I didn't know if I was ready for that, but I knew I had no choice anymore. "I don't know how to tell him," I said, my throat tight with fear. "I don't know how to make it right." Oliver leaned back in his seat, his fingers still lightly touching mine. "You don't have to tell him right now. You don't have to have all the answers. But you do need to be honest with him eventually. And with yourself." I nodded, even though the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I didn't know if I could face Adam, didn't know if I could carry the weight of this truth. But I couldn't keep living in this limbo, couldn't keep hiding from what was real. We sat there in silence for a while, the quiet of the cafe wrapping around us like a blanket. And even though I didn't have all the answers, even though I still didn't know what was going to happen next, I knew one thing. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't keep pretending like I had control over everything. It was time to face the music. And when I finally left the cafe, when I finally stepped back into the world that was waiting for me, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But maybe, for once, that was okay. Maybe this was the beginning of something real, something I couldn't deny any longer. And as I walked back to my car, the weight of everything still pressing down on me, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't the only one who was scared. Oliver was too. But together, maybe we could figure it out. Maybe, for once, we could stop pretending and start living.